Relatively small room. Thank you, Ellen. So I want to warmly welcome you to the Bauhaus Design and Livable Anthropocene exhibition and colloquium, celebrating the 102nd year of the Bauhaus School. And I'm very much looking forward to the sessions today because I don't know a great deal about Bauhaus, so I'm here as a learner as opposed to an expert. Before we proceed with this event, I'd like to acknowledge with deep respect the local Indigenous nations, the Lekwungen peoples, and the Songhees, Esquimalt and WSÁNEĆ peoples, whose deep historical relationship with these lands continue to this day. As you know, on September 30th, we, as an invited guest from these territories, commemorated the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, when we honored with deep respect and care the former residential school survivors, their families and communities, and the thousands of Indigenous children who do not return home from residential school. We were asked to also acknowledge and recommit to learning about and reflecting on the histories and ongoing impacts of colonial violence on Indigenous peoples in this country. And we were also asked to strengthen our resolve to respond to the urgent need to undertake the hard but very necessary work of reconciliation, decolonization, and anti-racism in this country and in our everyday lives. So what I learned about the importance of territorial acknowledgements is, first of all, the awareness of the Indigenous nations who lived on these lands prior to colonization and whose relationships to these lands continue in a very deep way until today. There's also an awareness of what made it possible for me to live and work on these Indigenous lands. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, acknowledging what my responsibilities are as an uninvited guest on these territories, including learning about the local Indigenous nations, the histories of this country, and so forth. So with that, I want to really welcome you to this event and this colloquium and exhibition. I want to thank the organizers. I'm not going to name them all. I'm sure that they will be named during the course of the day, and I fear that I might miss someone. The sponsors of this event, especially the Consulate General of the Federal Republic of Germany, Vancouver, who supplied the Bauhaus exhibition, and all of those involved in creating the exhibition, and of course the panelists at this colloquium. And as I said, I'm really looking forward to the sessions today. As I said, I'm here as a learner as opposed to an expert, and I'm really looking forward to the discussions today. Thank you so much.
So I'm Jonathan Benson, the University Librarian here. I'd like to thank my friend and colleague, Jean Molitor, for those words of welcome and for the territorial acknowledgement. You know, university librarians at the University of Victoria are long-lived and only the third since our foundation in 1963. So I've been here long enough to have seen new people move into every senior academic role, sometimes more than once, and long enough to have a sense of the modern trajectory of this institution and its aspirations. We have long valued our relationships with the First Nations peoples in this area, relationships that continue to deepen over time. Particularly in the past few years, we've entered into a new phase of engagement and dialogue as we seek to understand who we are as an institution in a Canada that continues to grapple with the trauma of residential schools. It's critical dialogue that Jean Molitor is referring to for every Canadian. I'm pleased to be part of an institution so committed to walking the difficult path of truth and reconciliation. So I want to extend to you all a warm welcome to the University of Victoria Libraries and the Mern Centre for Learning and McPherson Library, in which today's colloquium is taking place. I want to thank Consulate General Dr. Schmidt for making today possible. And I'm delighted that we're hosting this exhibition in this building, which is the busiest place on campus with upwards of 2 million visits per year into the building. Of course, we've been on a bit of a hiatus until recently with the pandemic, And this is the very first public event that we've held in person since the library, since early 2020. So welcome. It's so good to be able to gather and meet again in person. And what a wonderful way to start our in-person events in the library with this important and fascinating topic of Bauhaus and design. And again, what more appropriate place to meet? Libraries are institutions that tell us about ourselves, and they are our collective memory. They tell us what we know, what we do not know, what we need, what we value. And at the risk of stating the obvious, our research libraries have a past, they have a present, and they have a future. And the three are patently not the same thing, not the same thing. We have moved from being primarily repositories of the products of research to institutions that have a role throughout the entire research process, from creation to access to preservation. In the future, I believe, will be an era of engagement in which our critical role as stewards of information and partners in academic production will be recognized as ever more integral to faculty, researcher, and student success across all disciplines. We have all undergone and are still undergoing a breathtakingly deep and vast transformation of the way in which information is produced, transmitted, exchanged, and stored. The implications of this sea change are profound. And contrary to ill-informed and persistent media narratives often held by the public and indeed by sometimes our faculty and administrators, our libraries have entered a period of time in which, as physical and virtual spaces, as organizations that can model partnership and collaboration, as individuals who have the skills and tools to navigate the digital paradigm shifts, we have an ever more profound and fundamental impact on social, intellectual, and economic well-being of citizens and the vibrancy of educational institutions in our communities. Academic research libraries, in particular, I think, have entered a new golden age in which we have a role in every aspect of research creation, dissemination, and preservation. So Sir Colin St. John Wilson, architect of the New British Library, once commented that, and I quote, "Libraries are made of the stuff of myth. And so to every scholar, the library is a personal realm of secret topography. If such is the case for the library, so too must it be for our built landscape. Design matters. It matters deeply to the way in which we engage with the world around us. Walter Rupios asserted that Bauhaus's, quote, guiding principle was that design is neither an intellectual nor a material affair, but simply an integral part of the stuff of life, necessary for everyone in a civilized society. In essence, good design creates that secret topography that we traverse throughout our lives. Such design that is both inspiring and functional is difficult to achieve, but has a transformative power to shape the world around us in deeply meaningful ways. So, welcome on behalf of the University of Victoria. We have some wonderful speakers this afternoon, and without further ado, I'm going to pass you over to Dr. Marcus Millwright to open the Lekwungen and introduce our keynote speaker. Thank you very much.
Well, welcome everybody, and I should start probably with an apology in that what you're not seeing here is Thomas Hyde, and I'm going to do my best through today to fill his considerable shoes, and it is of course his vision along with many others that has led to this colloquium and exhibition. So I should say that he's been struggling with a cold this week, and out of an abundance of caution, he's decided that he shouldn't be here for today. But he's very much here in spirit, and I think also over the sort of medium of electronic communication as well. So thank you to Annalie and to Jonathan for those introductory words, and also again for the territory acknowledgement, which is something that I think we all need to not just say but reflect on in everything that we do here at the University of Victoria. So I'm here to introduce this event, the Bauhaus Design and the Livable Anthropocene, and it comes sort of with thinking about the century of exists also since the foundation of Bauhaus. In 1919, this event was due to happen last year, but of course was delayed as a result of the pandemic. And we're going to hear today about the extraordinary contribution of Bauhaus, and really it's impossible to think of the modern world without its impact being felt in almost every aspect of our lives. From the buildings that we're living and working in the University of Victoria. I was thinking down to the seats that we're using today. I mean, we can't really think of them without going back to Marcel Breuer and the sort of steel frame furniture that he created. And in the arts, it brought together, some of the most extraordinary designers and artists and architects of the early part of the 20th century. That impact being felt also as their work went out to other places. I think Joseph Albers going to the Black Mountain College and inspiring people like Robert Rauschenberg and Rupert Sauer. We see how those networks continue through to the present day. So we're going to be hearing a number of presentations, and of course the second part of the title talks about the livable Anthropocene. And I suppose this then leads us to think about these solutions, these designs which we associate with the Bauhaus. What does that mean now as we have to grapple with the Anthropocene, the realities of climate change, which are affecting every part of the world? And we only have to think back to the summer and the heat wave and forest fires to see that we desperately have to grapple with solutions. So where does the Bauhaus vision fit into that? So throughout today, I'm going to be introducing the different speakers. I'll be giving an introduction to our keynote speaker in a moment. And we'll have talks leading then to a panel discussion and then also a guided tour around Bauhaus-inspired buildings on the campus itself. So before we move on to all of these elements, I'll offer some acknowledgements and thanks. So thanks first to the Consulate General of the Federal Republic of Germany, Vancouver, the Mearns Centre and Macpherson Library, Faculty of Humanities, Department of Art History and Visual Studies, Programme for European Studies, the Department of German and Slavic Studies, the Centre for Global Studies, the Department of Philosophy, the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions, and UVic in the Anthropocene. And then also to our speakers, Aldous Mashaik, Menno Gebrecht, and Elena Plevmodido, and to the campus architecture guide, Don Lovell. And special thanks to the Consulate General of the Federal Republic of Germany, Vancouver, for supplying the Bauhaus exhibition. And also to Dr. Klaus Schmidt, who we had the pleasure of meeting last night over dinner, and to Ms. Daiminger for organization, and to Michael Lyons and Lisa Abrams in the library here. So as you can see, many people have contributed to making this event what it is. And then of course, having a colloquium is that opportunity for more dialogue and further contributions from you, the audience, through the day. So it's my great pleasure now to move on to introducing our keynote speaker, Aldous Mashaik. And so, excuse me a sec. So she is an urban historian with an interest in architecture, design, and the impact of cities on people's lives. And she's the author of Changing Image of Affordable Housing, Design, Gentrification, and Community in Canada and Europe, which was published by Ashgate in 2015. So she received her Master of Arts in American Studies and then PhD in Architectural History from the University of Bonn. And since then, she has been a postdoctoral research fellow at McMaster University in 2014-15,
as well as being a visiting scholar at the University of British Columbia in 2012 and the University of Auckland in 2008. So she resides in British Columbia, in Vancouver, where she works on the board of directors with the ICOMOS Canada, and also as a selection panelist for public art projects with the city of Richmond. So today, she's going to be talking, her talk is going to be called Dwelling, Architecture and Exploration of Housing Solutions for Challenges in the 21st Century. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Ulduz. So please, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Marcus, for the lovely introduction, and hello, everyone. I promise to be on time. The way this presentation is structured is the first half is history and Weimar Republic Bauhaus, and then the second part is a segue to 21st century affordable architecture in Vancouver. So tomorrow marks Germany's Day of Unity, commemorating the anniversary of the country's reunification in 1919. Germany has had many different epochs throughout its history, and dare say that Weimar Republic, where the Bauhaus was invented, is probably one of the most progressive and yet ambiguous ones. The depicted case studies that you will see here in today's presentation are focused on the social aspect of architecture. So Bauhaus, as mentioned already, is a very versatile discipline, and my part here focuses on the dwelling architecture in particular. And these case studies are supposed to showcase how architecture can help to create an integrated sense of community and inclusive neighborhoods. With that in mind, I would like to first of all explain why affordable housing is so important for our society. Sorry, this is not working.
Sorry, it should be that.
Yeah, maybe. Here, why don't I tell you to do the slides? No, thank you. So, next slide. Okay, thank you. So investing in adequate housing for the homeless, people who are at risk of homelessness, or those who live at core housing need, has proven to be more cost effective for society in the long run, rather than having them to use health and welfare services. There's also a direct correlation between deteriorated health and lack of affordable and livable housing. In a survey conducted about 2 years ago, 92% of medical professionals stated that their patients come to them expressing severe stress due to not being able to come up with enough rent. And as we know, stress causes all kinds of health conditions. So next slide. And the definition of affordable housing is when 30% of a household's gross income is either spent on rent or mortgage. This leaves the households with 70% left on disposable income, spending for things like leisure activities, education, clothes, or traveling. And then this again also boosts the economy, because the more spending power people have, obviously the more they can spend on other things. And then in a total, this adds to the livability and sense of empowerment of people. However, it took us a century or two to come to this realization. Next slide. So until the age of industrialization, architecture served as a practical and ideological construction that helped to emphasize and support the clerical world and the ruling class. Churches, temples, palaces, and castles were designed and constructed for the powerful religious groups as well as the aristocracy. As representations of the powerful and wealthy, these buildings served as symbols of decadent consumption and means for the elite to exert control over the masses. And then there is an example of how, so while the elite lived in such pompous houses or buildings, next slide. This image here depicts how the general public, or most importantly, the working class lived. So this is a damp, dark, tiny room, also called Mietskaserne, where up to the ratio was 1 to 20 people, so one room for 20 people. And the way it worked is that they would actually rent the bed on an hourly basis and take turns to work and then just come to sleep. So this is like a vast contrast to what the elite lived like and what other people lived like. However, next slide, only 25 years after this image that you just saw was taken, some of the most innovative and creative housing solutions were designed and built during Germany's interworld war years, most reputably in Weimar Republic as well as Red Vienna. And the next slide, the reason for this increased rise in affordable housing options derives from a combination of serendipitous circumstances. So number one, there was the age of industrialization that enabled architects and engineers to build faster with more cost-efficient materials such as concrete, glass, and steel. And then the other reason, click on the yes. The other reason that is a very important one was the political situation during Weimar Republic. So next slide. The right for adequate housing was actually enshrined in the constitution of the Weimar Republic, meaning that it was seen as a human right that everyone can or should have adequate livable dwelling where they can live in. And this right was implemented all through the Weimar Republic until the rise of the Nazi regime. And also the Weimar government implemented rental policies such as an income tax for those who actually owned a property, owned a real estate, called the Hauszinssteuer, that was implemented in 1924, and it's like a debt relief tax for people who own real estate, and that portion of the tax would go back into building affordable housing. And then the third and most important topic of this presentation was the awareness of the ethical role of the architect. Yeah, you can turn the yes, thank you. That now served for a new clientele, which was the people. Particularly architecture movements such as Neues Bauen, Bauhaus, and Red Vienna put a holistic approach and egalitarian design on architecture. The Bauhaus School, sorry, next, yeah. Yes, the Bauhaus School was founded in 1919 in Germany's Weimar. And it was once and foremost an interdisciplinary design school that approached its subject matter from a holistic perspective. And I think my other two colleagues will elaborate on other aspects of Bauhaus today. So students were taught the fundamental principles of the disciplines of crafts, arts, chromatics, textile, interior design, and architecture, a concept also known as Gesamtkunstwerk. Next slide. And the key players of Bauhaus were these three gentlemen. So Walter Rupios to the left, he was the first director and also longest serving director It started with Weimar, and then under his direction, they moved to Dessau. The reason for that is because Weimar became increasingly conservative and right-wing. So they were actually literally physically kicked out of the university building and moved to Dessau, where Hannes Meyer took over. Unfortunately, he only was the director for 2 years because the government thought he is too left-wing, almost communist, and they didn't want him there, so they fired him. And then under Mies van der Rohe, the Bauhaus had to close its doors for good, moving to Berlin. And then with the rise of the Nazi regime, they were no longer able to to operate as a school. And so I'm just going to focus on Rupios because he's like the most important one. He was a visual artist, draftsman, creative head, and architect, and he knew exactly how to bridge the gap between functionality and creativity. And he was also really good with marketing the Bauhaus School and the design, and putting it actually in places such as the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And in his famous manifest that he wrote in 1919, he expressed his points of view of the discipline of architecture by saying, the ultimate goal of all creative work should be architectural construction. Architects, painters, and sculptors are ought to recognize and learn to understand the multifaceted form of construction from a holistic approach. Only then will their body of work be filled with the architectural spirit. And they talk a lot about spirit and architecture and art. And this spirit, he again re-emphasized, next slide, in his other quote, saying that new architecture opens up any walls in a way curtains do and lets air, light, and sunshine in. So really, like, this air, light, sunshine is a guiding motto throughout the modernist movement of architecture, and other architects also picked up on that. And probably one most striking example of this design of Bauhaus architecture is the Dessau School that he actually built. Next slide. So there's a rendering of the Dessau School, and it consists of an asymmetrical silhouette with 5 interconnected components of the building. And each component intentionally is supposed to look differently and have also a different function. So for example, this white concrete building over here was the student dormitories with balconies. Connected to that was the administration building, and then there's a studio with a curtain wall facade, so that is actually a load-bearing facade, and then the other 2 buildings that had other functions. And then if you notice the buildings around, like on the back, they all have hip rooftops. They look like a stark contrast to this flat roof modernist, almost like a matchbox amalgamation of different boxes. So that really shows a different approach and design that the Bauhaus architects now approached. And the building is still exists. It was destroyed, but then restored and preserved. And you can actually go and have a look at it today. And next slide, only 1 mile away from the school was Dessau Church, and it was like a little village where they built housing for the other artists and the professors and also other key players of Bauhaus. So they really thought it through. It wasn't just one building sitting there like an island, but they really had a holistic approach to everything. And one big achievement of the Bauhaus architects was the establishing of large-scale housing estates. Next slide. So the reason for that is, again, because of the funding of of the government, and there was a boom in building affordable housing units in Germany itself between 1925 to 1929. So those are considered the golden years of the 20s. The number of annually built dwelling units rose by almost 200%, which is insane. And every second of those were publicly funded, particularly Berlin. Had over 145,000 of these units built within less than a decade, and those were all publicly funded. And actually in 2008, 8 of those were UNESCO World Heritage designated. And I could have really showed you guys any of those, but the reason I am today showing you Carnegie Estate is because I was fortunate enough to actually have a look at it myself. I had a friend who bought a unit, and I could look the inside and the outside. And I strongly believe when we talk about buildings, we should actually experience them in person ourselves. So next slide, next slide. It is situated in Berlin's Prenzlauer Berg, which is a neighborhood that used to be working class, but has been heavily gentrified for the past 2 decades. And here's a bird's eye view of the 6 estates that are U-shaped, and you can really see the rhythmical alignment of architecture, greenery, architectures, street life, and then so on. And this isn't really just made by coincidence, but rather the juxtaposition of nature and architecture was actually a distinct feature of modernist movement. So they really put a lot of emphasis on greenery in design to just loosen the stiffness of architecture. And then at the same time, they also focused on the aesthetics. Next slide, and next one. So the architects of Karl Legien were Franz Hillinger and Bruno Taut. And Taut is really famous for the usage of colors. And I should also mention that with Bauhaus, Johannes Itten, he actually taught the importance of color, the usage of color, and how it affects our mood. So it's not just, by coincidence that Taut is using the strong colorful facades looking to the backyard of this building. And then there's a door example that is all, so all yellow, very friendly and inviting, or at least I think. And then the interior is also very interesting. So they kept one unit in its original form so that visitors can come today and have a look. And they used to have central heater and hot water heat pumps, which was just revolutionary for working class dwellers to have these kind of luxury items, not today anymore. And as a matter of fact, people were complaining that the architecture of Bauhaus was too good for working class, and they shouldn't deserve that. So in closing the Bauhaus chapter, it can be said that Bauhaus demonstrated in the most profound ways how housing, architecture, and politics are interconnected. The Bauhaus architects posthumously have become global advocates for adequate dwelling solutions. So now I'm going to do a segue to the from 20th century Bauhaus to early 21st century. Next slide. No, the other one. Next one. Okay, yeah. We are in a global housing crisis as housing increasingly has become a commodity rather than a necessity. Since 2011, housing crisis in so-called hatch cities such as Hong Kong, Vancouver, Toronto, London, and Sydney have increased by over 50%, creating vast amounts of increased assets for the wealthy by making housing unaffordable for most of the households. And I just want to mention the difference between goods and assets. So you buy a good like a car or clothes, to use it, right? But an asset, the function of an asset is you buy it in the hope to sell it for more value. So it's seen as a commodity or as an investment. And when we actually treat housing, which is a human right, as a commodity, that creates all kinds of problems globally. And in her 2017 report, former Special UN Rapporteur for Housing, Lailana Farha notes, housing and urban real estate have become the commodity of choice for corporate finance, a safety deposit box for the wealthy, a repository of capital and excess liquidity from emerging markets, and a convenient place for shell companies to stash their money with very little transparency. She further concludes that global real estate represents nearly 60% of the value of global assets, out of which 75% come from residential real estate. And she is actually featured in a movie titled Push, directed by Frederick Gerton. And this is a short trailer I want to show you that really highlights the problematic situation. Are we able to play it?
When vintage clothing shops show up. And now everybody's gonna go up and then they're all Push.
In the Greater Toronto Area in the last 30 years, housing prices have increased by 425%.
Then we start asking, who's gonna live in cities? Who are cities for? They wanna raise the rent up to like $900 each. If it goes to $3,400, then I have to make at least $100,000. I was seeing the whole area change. They start buying up properties because it's a fantastic investment for them.
When I hear people today say it's gentrification, one reaction, an ironic reaction is, if only. It's much deeper.
Owning the house is only a means to making money.
New owners have taken over. We haven't met them, we haven't seen them, we don't know anything about them. It could be Frosty the Snowman for all I know.
I heard one of the councils said, if you can't live in Notting Hill, then you shouldn't be in Notting Hill. Who the fuck is he to say something like that?
Like it's that in the middle of the street and no traffic coming.
Pero a veces discariso del nuovo dove capitalismo legale si può.
Gold is not a human right. Housing is. We need to reclaim the fundamental right to housing.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, gold is not a human right, but we, treat it like the ultimate solution to everything. And the history of affordable housing that is livable and affordable, provides residents with adequate solutions, is actually not linear. So I just showed you Bauhaus, which was quite progressive, but for whatever reason, in the 50s and 60s, all the way till the 80s, urban planners made huge mistakes with not paying attention to the design aspect of affordable housing. And design is not neutral. It does play an important role in creating tunnel-blind architecture that is also inclusive. So here is an example of Siemensstadt that was also part of Bauhaus. And in the middle here, you see pre-IGO that was built in the 50s and then had to be demolished in the mid-70s because they didn't really pay attention to aspects such as height and how far away the buildings are from each other, where the windows, where the doors are situated. And this ended up to be a complete disaster and failure in architecture. And all of the 33 high-rise buildings had to be demolished by the end of the 70s. And architects and urban planners learned the lessons how to not build affordable housing. And so the following 4 case studies that I'm going to show you here are contemporary case studies set in Vancouver, British Columbia. And it's not an ultimate solution, but it's just a modest attempt to show how it can be done in a successful way. And I'm gonna start with my first case study, which is Bull Hill, situated in the West End, which is part of the downtown neighborhood. Mole Hill is the last remaining intact residential block of Vancouver's oldest houses that were saved from being demolished through a community initiative in the around 2000. And the community was able to convince the city of Vancouver to purchase these houses and turn them into affordable housing solutions. So a total of 36 houses were rescued, out of which the city bought 27 and donated them to the nonprofit housing society Mole Hill Community Housing Society. The architecture firm that was hired for the restoration was Hudson, Baker, Bonifide, and Hayden. They don't exist anymore. Donald Laxton's Heritage Company was hired for the restoration of the building's facade, which is very important. And so you can see all the different colors. So they were able to restore the facades to its original color and shape. And the buildings you see inside range from studio apartment to 3-bedroom apartment, which means that it's a very inclusive project, a housing project that houses singles to large families. A total of 178 units were built, and the rent is geared to income. So 30% of households' rent is paid for the, 30% of the household's income is paid for rent. Can you show the next? Yeah, so this is a bird's eye view, and you can see the entire block. And also, again, this juxtaposition between houses and greenery is very striking in the Mole Hill example. And this is not, again, coincidence. Residents are encouraged to go outside and mingle and socialize. There is a community garden. There is a couple of child care places and a playground, and there's a creek running through. So really, when you walk through it, it's a healthy, vibrant, and affordable neighborhood. Next case study is set in Chinatown, which is part of the downtown east side. And it is a housing co-op. It is believed that housing co-ops can encompass the closest form of healthy and vibrant mixed income housing concepts, which is why I chose this case study. It's called Laurie Quill. Actually, Laurie Quill was a German lady who lived in the downtown east side, Hannelore Quill. And this is, again, a bird's eye view of the building. Interesting case about this one is that it was already built by a private developer in the 1990s. He couldn't sell the units because nobody wanted to invest in Chinatown back then. It was considered too risky. So the developer ended up selling his building to the Co-operative Housing Federation of BC, which is an umbrella organization for houses, co-op houses in BC. And they converted this building into 97 units with different rent models. And the architect for this was Joe Wei. He was an activist in Chinatown in the downtown east side. He built many buildings for the community, and he was really the right choice for designing this building and adaptively reusing it. And I actually had the pleasure to talk to Joe before he passed away, and I asked him how he solved challenges such as the height restriction that is in Chinatown. And he explained you have to have the higher density set back. Instead of pushing the density vertically, you set it back horizontally. So really they work horizontally to make more space inside the buildings. And when I asked him about his approach to designing the building itself, he explained it has to do with truth and community and understanding what the building is for, as opposed to designing the projects for oneself. You have to understand how the community works and its nature. So really, he actually engaged the community towards designing. And one of the concrete examples of this consultation with the community is the rooftop garden on the 3rd floor, as well as the children's playground. And there is also a community space, so people can actually meet and socialize, which is so important for when you live in a building and you have to, get to know your neighbors, and you want to trust your neighbors. I'm gonna skip the next few slides. So this is the facade, and yeah, that's the rooftop garden. Okay, so that's my 3rd example, which is also set in the Downtown East Side. Probably the most controversial one, which is the redevelopment of the Woodwards, the former Woodwards department store. So what happened here is the department store was standing empty for about 10 years and nobody wanted to do anything with it. It was in a rather deteriorated neighborhood, Gastown. And when the announcement of the Vancouver Olympic Games happened in 2003, the city bought the land, the building from the province for only $5 million, with the aim to completely revitalize this portion. And the reason for that is it is the gateway between the downtown, which is popular and affluent and touristy, and Gastown and Downtown East Side, which is, the no man's land and nobody wants to go. So they really wanted to make sure that visually it isn't inviting, whatever is set there is inviting for people to come to the Downtown East Side and shop and put money in that neighborhood. They hired the architecture firm Enrique's Architects, and Gregory Enrique and his dad Richard, they built a lot of buildings in the Downtown East Side for the poor. So they were the chosen architecture firm. Westbank was the developer, and the result is an entire block of different heights. So there is 2 towers and then there is 2 low-rise buildings, and it's a mixed income, mixed use housing solution. So on the towers, there is 536 private units for condominium units for sale, and 200 units spread across the 2 towers are for low-income people. And the housing model is, one type is rent is shelter rate, which is $375, so for the poorest to house. The other type is 30% rent geared to income. It's a very diverse form of housing. There's, so this facade is the facade of the Heritage Tower. They call it the Heritage Tower, which is ironic because it was built in 2010, but intentionally they wanted to do this illusion of steel and red, and also the shape is supposed to remind of the Flatiron building. That is the building that you see when you are approaching from downtown towards Gastown. And this is the more expensive one with the less units for low-income people, whereas the other more modernist style one was where more units were in. And so, yeah, I'm just gonna skip what I want to say and go to the next one. And this is actually a very exciting case study, and it could be something that we will see increasingly. The reason for that is that the restoration of the Central Presbyterian Church was done almost exclusively with private funded money. So all the other case studies I showed you were funded with all 3 levels of government, whereas this one was just funded by the developers themselves. It was a bit of an unusual situation. So the church owns the land in the West End, and they are asset rich but cash poor. And developers are hungry for land and density. So they entered a partnership with the church to restore the deteriorated church, agreed to build 43 units on top of it for low-income seniors, which were members of the church. In return, they would get air parcel rights and build this high-rise 15-story building to rent them at market rent for the general people. And it was a win-win situation. Revitalized, relived the part it was situated. It is on a very busy street. So Davie and Surlo are both very active streets with lots of foot traffic and streets. And yeah, so in total, there were 43 social housing units built and 168 market rent buildings. And when you look closer, just go back. Yeah, here are the Molehill houses, single detached houses, which circles back to our first case study that we showed. And I'm still in my time, great. So yeah, in conclusion, it can be said that we need to look at buildings within the temporal context, examining how they relate both to their immediate environment and the culture of the city. As such, century-old single detached houses become rental mixed income homes for diverse communities. Former department stores set the ground for mixed-use, mixed-income tower blocks, and churches are no longer symbols of decadent consumptions for the elite, but a space that provides housing and community services for all. And I would like to close this presentation with a quote, yes, that's the one, by Montreal architect Alberto Pérez Gómez. So Alberto Pérez Gómez was a professor of Gregory Henriquez, the architect of the last 2 case studies. And he concludes that to take a leading role in contemporary issues, the architect of the 21st century must be a social activist, a realist, a poet, a political technician, and a utopian. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that lovely talk, and I think it was so good that it also links together, Bauhaus and that sort of history with, the sorts of things that can be done, so imaginatively in the sort of contemporary environment. So I'm hoping you're willing to kind of sort of stand up on the podium again for questions. Yeah, sure. But perhaps if I'll take the sort of,
yeah, I just want to mention that it could have gone 2 ways, this presentation. If I just wanted to focus on design, it would have been West Coast modernism, because the West Coast modern architects were heavily influenced by the European architects. But the West Coast modernist architects weren't really focused so much on building dense buildings and affordable housing. It was more single detached houses in remote areas like West Vancouver. So it didn't really feel right. And since this topic is about sustainability and solving solutions for 21st century, I thought this might be more adequate.
Great. So I'll just, if I may, I'll start with a question and then sort of open it out to the audience. I'm struck by the point you made right at the beginning, which is that 30% threshold of income that counts as something being affordable, and of course it's a huge problem in Canada as it is elsewhere. But it sort of then kind of got me thinking that architects obviously are part of a much bigger solution, because really architecture has got to be allied to economic policy and things like raising of minimum wage and affordable healthcare and all these sorts of things. So do you see when you're thinking about these sorts of architectural developments, are you also sort of thinking about that kind of bigger, social policies that are required?
Yeah, you're correct, Marcus. Affordable housing is way more complex. It's not just one component. This is why I mentioned in the Bauhaus portion that it was industrialization, the political climate, and the architect. And yes, it is important to also have the political climate that enables these kind of developments, and the understanding that we need to look into inclusivity when we build buildings, and what you just mentioned was low income of people in BC, and so Vancouver in particular has actually one of the lowest median incomes in Canada, and yet it is the least affordable city in all of North America. So there's a discrepancy, right? And the reasons for that are multifaceted. We could stay here and talk all night, but my presentation today was just focused on the architecture and the role of the architect and what they can do with their skill set to build inclusive neighborhoods and also include the wishes of the community in the design, right?
Okay, thank you. So we've got plenty of chance for questions. So if you're happy taking them from the floor.
Sure.
Yeah.
Or do I get to pick?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm looking forward to our roundtable later on. Can you tell us a little bit more about the role of the community and how the architects consulted with the community, said what type of local level political processes were at play in designing these and coming up with these projects?
So probably the best case is Woodwards redevelopment. There's actually whole books about it, how the development came into place. And the Woodwards, as I mentioned, it was an empty lot and nobody wanted to do anything. It was just standing empty for 10 years. And there was squatters squatting the empty department store. They wouldn't go outside, get out, and they were actually pushed out. And then the community got mad. They said, with your plan to make it all condominiums, that was the initial plan, just condominiums, you will push away the locals who have been living here for decades. So what they did is they actually took the rising voices of the community members seriously and consulted with them, asked them what it is that they want. Can they imagine to live in one tower, sharing same space with people who, buy units and live there? So it was ideally, everyone, in an ideal world, everyone has a say, but as we know, money rules the world. However, for the Woodwards, that was probably the closest to an ideal. It came in consulting the community and really taking them seriously, I think. Yeah. Menno.
Great, I really enjoyed your paper. I have one question. I wasn't wondering if because you've got a really good number of examples from contemporary Vancouver. And I was wondering if you were also thinking about some of the post-war apartment buildings that were built to house returning soldiers, which are 3 to 4 story walk-ups. And you see quite a few here in Victoria. You also see them in Vancouver. And there's also I've forgotten the name of the tower, but at the base of, I believe, the Cambie Street Bridge, it's a kind of a 3-winged tower that was constructed in the 50s or so, which is also modeled after much of the affordable housing that was built in Germany. So I'm wondering if you had thought about that as well in terms of structuring, all of these ideas of how the legacy of the Bauhaus and Vancouver architectural design.
Yeah, so as mentioned, it's not linear, right? They make mistakes and they learn from mistakes, and particularly the post-war era wasn't really concerned. I mean, you are an architecture historian, so I don't know, maybe you disagree, but it wasn't really considered a success in mass housing, and especially sustainable mass housing, because of the lack of consideration for design. There were also other aspects, like they didn't think it through with who's running the buildings, how are they financing it, right? Like it's actually a business, like running these non-profit housings, it's a business. You have to have also an economic background to know how to sustain them, but architecture plays a role, and modernist, post-war architecture typically wouldn't be a poster child in affordable housing. Yeah. Yes.
But to go back a little bit further, before you started on the case studies in Vancouver, you realized that the last German elections that happened last month, Sunday, in Berlin, they had a special vote on whether to expropriate big property owners of apartment buildings. And it was not a binding vote, but the vote got a majority of votes. The better. Now the city of Berlin has to wonder how it can come up with billions of dollars to buy out these property developers. The other thing, which I find quite interesting, in the latest issue of The Economist, they point out that in the United States, big companies like BlackRock are buying up not only apartment buildings, but suburban whole areas, because they have become totally only an asset. So it is a very, very frightening situation for people that need housing.
Yes, you're correct. Globally, housing is a very scary subject. And as mentioned, it's considered as an asset to buy real estate. Well, you know, again, it's a complex topic, and we can approach it from all kinds of perspectives, and everyone has an idea. But this one here today is just on the architecture and the design. So, yeah. Oh, and also, since you mentioned Berlin, sadly, just 2 of the housing settlements, these large-scale housing settlements, remained as a low-income rental housing. The rest was sold for private developers and then sold as condominium buildings, which completely lost its purpose of, you know, the initial purpose of housing low-income people. Yeah.
You know that in Berlin, even before the First World War, there were housing developments in special areas, not in the center, but in some of the outside places, which were designed around communal living. With communal places in the walk up 4, 5, 6-story apartment buildings, and with quite a lot of design around them.
Yes.
They were not for workers, but they were for middle income people.
Yes, yeah, that was an example imported from England. Yes, Garden City. So I'm gonna be like just respectful. I think the other speakers.
Well, you're still good. So
oh, am I? Oh, good. Okay.
You've got another sort of 7 or 8 minutes.
Oh,
questions if there are.
wonderful. Okay, so you and then I just go like
Hi. It seems that up until maybe the late 70s, and I'm kind of speaking from a Vancouver experience, that in terms of higher density accommodation, it was either rental, but co-ops were quite popular. And then come the 80s, it was the strata condominium, and they lost favor. And I know, like in Whistler, for instance, when it became a city, one way that they were able to find out or provide housing for people who actually work there were through co-ops. And I'm just wondering, do you see any renewed interest in that co-op solution, or even talking about other places like in England, for instance, the council house for providing housing for large numbers of people?
Yeah, so right now what is happening in Vancouver is they are renegotiating the lease agreement with a big portion that is all co-op houses, South Fales Creek South, which, yes, was leased to co-ops in Vancouver in the 80s and 90s, and the lease is up, and they're now discussing what to do. And just what you mentioned, co-op housings are not favorable, and I actually found out firsthand why that is. So I found a really nice place that I actually can afford in a nice neighborhood in Vancouver, and I went to the bank and I said, it's just 400,000. Can I have the mortgage? And they said, well, what's the land like? I don't know. What do you mean? So yes, turns out it's a co-op, and the bank will not give you mortgage if it's a co-op. So can you understand the problem here? If you are a regular person working and having a regular income, you need to have mortgage, and the bank tells you, sorry, we will not give you mortgage because it's a co-op and the land is worth nothing, and that's all we care about. We don't care where you live. Then people don't find it attractive to live in a co-op. Makes sense, right? So unfortunately, that's what it is. Yeah. However, having said that, the former UN Rapporteur for Housing before Lailana became a rapporteur, Milun Kotari, he actually explicitly mentioned that co-op housing is a very good and sustainable solution to our housing crisis. So, yeah. So somebody else, yeah, you. Okay.
That's the same type of question. And affordable housing, as you showed it, was close to less affordable housing, but was not mixed with it. Is that a policy? Is there a policy in Vancouver, for instance, to say that in each new building,
yeah,
there is a necessary, a mandatory proportion of
oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, it's called pepper potting. Yeah, not explicitly, but when developers want to have extra density, which they almost always do, they enter into a community amenity contribution deal, which means that they either have to build a portion of that building for low-income people, rent geared to income, or they have to give funding for public art or other amenities in that neighborhood. So almost all the time, it does happen that there is extra funding for one of these scenarios in Vancouver. Yeah.
We should probably stop there. So.
Yeah, okay.
Well,
thank you. Thanks.
So we're going to have a chance to be able to look around the exhibition. Oh, sorry, I can take this off. We're going to have a chance to look around the exhibition, but it's my pleasure now to introduce the Consul General for the Federal Republic of Germany, Vancouver, Dr. Klaus Otto Schmidt, who is going to say some words about the exhibition. Please, thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Klaus Schmidt, and I'm a renter in Vancouver and the owner of a house, a nice house in the southern part of Germany. And my son is living in an apartment we own in Berlin. I really would love to continue with this discussion about Berlin and the living conditions there. Berlin is a, no, I should stop it now. I only wanted to mention that the center of Berlin, only 20 years ago, Mayor Wowereit sold thousands of cheap apartments, cheap dwellings to two major housing conglomerates in order to get some money, in order to save his household. I should stop here. It's a very complicated discussion what's going on. And Berlin is a renter city. The vast majority is renting there. And the minority of people owning houses is different in the southern parts of Germany. In Bavaria and Baden-Württemberg is different. More people are saving money, are able to invest, and of course should have the money to modernize. Now with the needs of climate change and to modernize houses, you have to have a lot of money. to invest in solar panels and all other means of renewable energies. This is very costly, and there aren't so many people who are able to invest this much money. But it's a very interesting discussion, and maybe we can follow up on this on a different event. So, but let me turn back to Bauhaus, and we have just watched a movie, Push, an excerpt from this movie, and this leads me to the question: what have James Bond and Bauhaus in common? What? Do you have an idea? No, no time to die. In other words, they are pretty much alive. And as the latest James Bond film was due to be released last spring, our Bauhaus exhibition was due to be shown here in Victoria at UVic, and we had, due to COVID, we had to postpone this a little bit. Now we are have the same pace again. We are catching up, and I'm really anxious to see James Bond. The latest James Bond, 3 hours, more than 3 hours. And hopefully we have more than 3 hours to discuss and watch all what's going on with Bauhaus here. Well, all the more we are happy to celebrate today 102 years of Bauhaus, and at the same time our already mentioned 31st anniversary of German unity. Germany is pretty young. United Germany, the reunited Germany, but we have a rich culture which includes Bauhaus. Well, when we celebrated 100 years of Bauhaus 2 years ago in Vancouver, we invited the photographer Jean Molitor from Berlin. And we asked him to show his exhibition in Vancouver. And we had to show this twice, now the third time. And at the same time, we invite him to do a Vancouver exhibition, a photo exhibition on Vancouver with Bauhaus-related architecture. I know some of the objects he have chosen, and I'm really anxious to see his new exhibition, which will be shown next year, hopefully in Berlin. And maybe we can bring this back to Vancouver and to see how he has seen Vancouver. And of course, with Photoshop, you can change something, but you will easily identify some of these interesting objects. We have one here, it's the Vancouver City Hall. For me, it's not a real Bauhaus product, it's more Art Deco. It looks a little bit like Gotham City. That's it. Anyway, we can discuss this later. Jean Molitor, unfortunately, is not with us today, but he is connected via Zoom, and I hope he can follow us via Zoom, and maybe we should give him a big hand of applause. Yes. You know, he's very happy that we are able to present his exhibition here again. And he's very busy. He's traveled the whole world showing his Bauhaus exhibitions from Ankara to Bern, Switzerland, from Russia with love to Africa, also with love and interest. And now he is staying in Berlin and maybe celebrating Germany's reunification birthday tomorrow. I shouldn't forget to mention that Thomas Heid was with us from the very first moment to have this realize this exhibition. I'm very grateful, and I would also for his efforts, and I would like to include in my thanks the faculties involved, the library, and of course UVic, the university. We have had with UVic during the last 3 years very interesting projects. I would like to remind you of the presentations on the occasion of 30 years of the fall of the Berlin Wall, as well as last year's presentation on Mrs. Crook. And today we have on this leg, the third leg, this presentation on Bauhaus. I think it's a good idea to include also modern design of Germany. And later you will touch on Brown, Dieter Rams, the famous Brown designer. He's still alive, a little bit shaky, 85 years old, but he is still very active. And the Brown company is celebrating 100 years this year. So, and it's very successful. Now it belongs to the Gillette conglomerate. It's American, but they still kept their identity following this Bauhaus language, form follows function. And whenever I'm standing in front of an audience and have to explain a little bit about Brown design, and I show this watch. This is an evergreen, now I guess 30, 40 years old. The leather band is a little bit ruined, but it works. And I have always with me this another product made in Germany from a Heidelberg company, 100% made in Germany, Lamy. I can only recommend this. This is relatively cheap. It works always. And the design is Bauhaus. You see the circle, the geometric elements, and it works. And it's timeless, a timeless timepiece and a timeless working device. So I'm quite happy and proud to present this products made in Germany, which are definitely influenced by the Bauhaus language. Well, I mentioned already Jean Molitor did his presentations 2 years ago here, and he is eager to come back to Canada as soon as possible again, and maybe we can follow up with him here at UVic, if you don't mind, and see what he's done in the past worldwide, and having his Vancouver pieces here. Well, I guess the Bauhaus legacy will go on, as James Bond will go on. Both will survive. I have the impression that the world will need also in the future air, light, and more sunshine. Thank you very much. And now I guess it's time for some.
So we have, thank you so much. And so we have now time for a break. So we'll be reconvening here at 1:20 for the next of our talks. So we have some refreshments here, and of course the exhibition to look at as well. Thank you.
Have sort of unified questions from the floor, and then on to panel discussion. So Thomas gave me strict instructions to keep the introductions fairly brief here, which is in no way a reflection of the importance of our speakers. It was more to maximize the amount of time that we could spend on the talks and the discussions, which of course are the most important things here. So it's great pleasure to introduce our first speaker of the afternoon session. That's Menno Hubrecht, who I've known for many years because he has both been a student in art history and visual studies and also is a very valued sessional instructor in the department. His teaching and research interests include the history of modern and contemporary architecture, art and design, and his recent publications include a book on airport design, which he'll perhaps mention in his talk, as well as articles on architectural theory and digital design. So, Menno, please.
So here, the controller, I guess. What can you like that?
Exactly.
Okay, perfect. Let's see if that works.
It's good. Perfect. Thank you. Okay. So first, I would like to thank Dr. Tom Hyde for organizing this event and inviting me to speak about the Bauhaus. I would also like to thank the Consulate General of the Federal Republic of Germany, Dr. Klaus Schmidt, for bringing Jean Molitor's photographs to UVic. So as Dr. Milwright noted a few moments ago, I teach art and architectural history here at UVic, and I address the Bauhaus in my courses on modern architecture and design. So today I'm going to provide a brief overview of the Bauhaus's formation, some of the products its faculty and students designed, and how it influenced German design schools and designers after World War II. I will also illustrate how the Bauhaus's approach to design offers us insights into how we can live more sustainably during our current geological era, the Anthropocene. So I will discuss how the Bauhaus taught students to make simple and practical designs that could be mass produced, and how other German design schools and companies have retained this ethos and concentrated on creating well-made products that consumers will want to keep for as long as possible. So Marion Brandt's teapot from 1924, which you can see on the left, demonstrates how the Bauhaus encouraged standardized designs that could be built in a factory. The school, however, did not always concentrate on creating prototypes for mass manufacture. When Walter Gropius founded the Bauhaus in Weimar in 1919, he sought to open a school where students would primarily create handcrafted artworks and objects. So in this regard, it was similar to the arts and crafts movement in Britain, whose proponents, such as William Morris, critiqued industrialization, championed crafts, and looked to the medieval period for inspiration. So the school's name, the Bauhaus, means building house, and it was inspired by the medieval Masons' Lodge. The school's founding manifesto also hearkened to the pre-modern period with Lionel Feininger's Cubist-inspired woodcut of a Gothic cathedral, which appeared on the title page. Gropius' attention to craft contrasted with his ideals prior to World War I. His design for the Facade factory from 1912 employed industrial materials such as steel and glass. So this innovative building is a landmark with regard to architectural history, since Gropius and Adolf Meyer used these materials to create a transparent corner, which you can see here. So though Gropius became critical of the machine age after witnessing the devastation of the First World War, so the large-scale organization of troops and the industrialization of war machinery paralleled the work structure within factories and mass-produced goods. Gropius and Meyer's 1921 house design for Adolf Sommerfeld, a Berlin-based entrepreneur, illustrates the Bauhaus's initial focus on craft. So the home employs traditional materials and building techniques. So for instance, the wood joinery visible in the corners is typically carved by hand, and it certainly contrasts with a mass-produced item such as a steel I-beam. So during the Bauhaus's first couple years, the instructors also encouraged expressionist forms of art. Johannes Itten, who taught the preliminary course, contended that there was a connection between form and feeling, and his classes included practices such as meditation and deep breathing. In 1923, there's a distinct shift when Gropius declares that the school should concentrate on new technologies. And we can see how the students' designs changed drastically within a few years. On the left, we see Max Crahan's free-thrown earthenware pitcher that shows the hand of the artist. And on the right, we see Marion Brandt's prototype for a teapot that had a standardized design with geometric forms such that it could be easily reproduced in a factory. So what spurred this shift? In 1921, Theo van Doesburg went to Weimar to lecture on de stijl, a Dutch movement meaning the style. It sought to forge collaborations between artists and industry, where artists would create designs that could be mass-produced in factories. So here we're looking at the cover of the journal De Stijl, which van Doesburg edited. In 1919, the De Stijl periodical featured this chair, which Gerrit Rietveld created as an example of a piece of furniture that could be mass-produced and that would replace more expensive handcrafted designs. So this, of course, contrasted with the Bauhaus's craftsman ideal. So a number of Bauhaus students attended van Doesburg's lecture. So Marcel Breuer was particularly impressed with De Stijl. So he began his studies at the Bauhaus in 1920 and was eventually appointed as the head of the carpentry shop. In this set of children's tables and chairs, Breuer employed standardized widths of wood such that it could be easily made in a factory. The Bauhaus students also learned about Russian constructivism during the early 1920s, and it further solidified their desire to create designs that could be mass-produced. So constructivism began to take shape during the revolutionary period in Russia. The first working group of constructivists, for example, was established in 1921, 1 year before the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was founded. So this avant-garde group sought to create new types of art for a new socialist country. So artists like Alexander Rodchenko chose to abandon fine art in order to create production art, which was primarily focused on practical design solutions for everyday life. So here we're looking at the standardized furniture he designed for the USSR's pavilion at the 1925 Expo in Paris. So the Russian pavilion was trying to evoke an image of the USSR as an industrial nation. So while this certainly was the country's aim, it had not yet reached this level of industrialization. So even though Rodchenko's chairs and tables appear to be industrially produced, they were actually made as a small batch in a workshop. So returning back to Germany and the Bauhaus, so in 1922, some of the Bauhaus students encountered works like this. So Russian constructivism at an exhibition in Berlin, as well as at a constructivist congress in Weimar. So with this rising interest in the style and constructivism among the students, Gropius decides to shift the Bauhaus's focus to industrial design. So in 1923, he released a new declaration that art should look to technology and industry. Oops, as I drop the technology, I'm not looking to technology. A rift between Gropius and Johannes Itten, the preliminary courses instructor, also arose during this period. So Itten wanted the students to concentrate on the act of autonomous and expressionist artistic creation, whereas Gropius wanted the students to focus on designs that would serve a social purpose. So Itten decides to resign. The Hungarian artist and photographer Laszlo Moholy-Nagy was hired as his replacement. So unlike Itten, he had a positive view of machines and industry. In his preliminary class, Moholy-Nagy taught students about industrial materials such as steel and glass, constructive problem-solving techniques, and how to make an object technically reproducible. So the Bauhaus also abandoned some of its first courses such as ceramics and wood carving, and instead students would learn about photography, advertising, and furniture design. Marcel Breuer's Wassily chair, one of the Bauhaus's most well-known designs, illustrates how the school adopted new materials. So the chair's frame is made from tubular steel, which was used for bicycle frames. The hollow metal tubes allow the chair's frame to be both light and strong. Breuer also employed tubular steel for his nesting tables from 1926. Like the Wassily chair, these tables could be efficiently mass-produced in a factory. Now, his glass-fronted cabinet from the same year has a striking resemblance to the type of mass-produced furniture that we purchase today at stores such as IKEA. Like many of our current furniture designs, Breuer employed plywood supports with a veneer. And this is when a thin layer of wood, in this case elm, is applied over cheaper sheets of plywood in order to maintain an aesthetic of solid wood. Another notable characteristic of Bauhaus design following the turn to industry in 1923 is geometric form. Objects composed with right angles and parallel lines were far easier to manufacture than those with complicated shapes and forms. So in this photograph of Gropius's office, we can see his geometric design for the room's furniture as well as the light fittings. And what you'll notice is there's a grid-like arrangement of the lighting tubes. So his office was part of a 1923 Bauhaus exhibition, which displayed the school's new direction towards industrial production. The exhibition was in part organized to demonstrate the school's viability, particularly for the Turning state government, which funded the Bauhaus. However, the school lost this funding the following year when right-wing parties came into power in Turning. This wasn't entirely surprising since the Bauhaus had been critiqued by conservatives since its inception, and the loss of funding was also likely due to the products' high prices and the school's somewhat disorganized links with industry. So in March 1925, the Bauhaus at Weimar is closed, but it reopened during the same year in Dessau, and Gropius designed the school's new building. So the Bauhaus also rebranded itself as a school of design at this point as well. Now, the printing shop, for instance, acquired more modern printing presses, and it became more focused on advertising. So here we see Herbert Byers, the head of the printing shop's advertisements for Bauhaus ashtrays. So even though these objects were overpriced during the school's early years at Weimar, costs were reduced as the school forged better ties with industry. Lighting designs, wallpapers, and Breuer's Wassily chair were soon industrially produced by major companies. Textiles were also successfully managed or manufactured and sold. So these largely constituted abstract geometric designs, since these were easier to mass produce than textiles with representational images. It's also notable that the weaving workshop achieved some of the highest successes among the Bauhaus departments, since Gropius did not consider it to be as prestigious as other fields such as architecture and furniture design. And these textile designs were largely made by women. Gropius had wanted to limit the number of female students at the school, and they were pushed into learning about weaving, bookbinding, and pottery, whether they were interested or not. Now, female students were discouraged from working with metal or furniture, but Marion Brandt is an exception. And after she began her studies at the Bauhaus in 1923, Laszlo Moholy-Nagy encouraged her to join the metal workshop. And Brandt demonstrated that she had exceptional skills in this field, and she's created many of the Bauhaus's most iconic metalwork designs. And in 1928, she was appointed as the head of the metal workshop. Many of her lamp designs were also very successful. So this table lamp was commercially produced and popular with consumers. So sadly, the Bauhaus at Dessau was forced to close in 1932 when the Nazis came into power in local elections. The school moved to Berlin, but it was closed for good the following year. So with the rise of Nazism, Walter Gropius, Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, and Marcel Breuer eventually fled to the United States. And there they became instructors at universities, as well as practicing architects and designers. So we see some of the Bauhaus's legacy materialize in design and design education in the United States. But what about Germany? The legacy of the Bauhaus continues at the Hochschule für Gestaltung at Ulm, which opened in 1953. So its first director, Max Bill, was a student at the Bauhaus, and he designed the school's buildings. And many of its visiting teachers were former Bauhaus instructors. So the Hochschule für Gestaltung at Ulm has similar aims as the Bauhaus. It sought to teach students to create simple, practical, efficient, and aesthetically pleasing designs that would ameliorate people's lives. As the school's first director, Bill encouraged students to create good design, or die gute Form, which he defined as a natural form for a product developed out of its functional and technical requirements, and which fulfills the intended purpose in a visually appealing way. So the school had a research-based focus in order to determine the design's potential performance and practicality, and individual artistic expression was not the central concern. The curriculum included courses on mathematics, statistics, sociology, anthropology, psychology, and cultural history. So the aim was to design effective products that would improve people's lives and last a long time. The intent to create a timeless object contrasted with other designers who focused on creating ephemeral products which were intended to go out of style. This type of planned obsolescence defined the American automotive industry beginning in the late 1920s. It is known as styling. When Harley Earl began working with General Motors in 1927, he introduced a design process that allowed the company to quickly develop new vehicles that weren't all that mechanically different from earlier models, but appeared as a fresh design. So in order to stimulate consumer desire, Earl introduced models with new body styles and color palettes. GM, however, did not need to make costly changes at their factories to produce these new vehicles, and it made it seem as though the earlier models were obsolete. So Harley Earl remained with GM until 1958, and he designed many of their vehicles' iconic body styles. In 1948, for instance, he added the tail fin to a Cadillac. This entirely non-functional addition was marketed as a luxury item. So the tail fin is the central feature of this late 1950s ad for a Cadillac Fleetwood, which claims that the vehicle is the world's most eloquent possession. Now, if you look closely, you'll see that the tail fin appears below two wealthy white couples who are standing next to the Ritz-Carlton. Now, Max Bill, the director at the Hochschule für Gestaltung at Ulm, was especially critical of these unnecessary, ostentatious features, which he called substandard and wantonly frivolous in a 1948 lecture on function and beauty. Radio manufacturers in the United States also followed a design ethos driven by planned obsolescence. During the 1930s, manufacturers employed new types of plastic for cases that were expected to go out of style. So here we have Harold Van Doorn's 1933 design for a casing that resembles an Art Deco skyscraper. The Sears Silvertone from 1936 features a streamlined plastic casing that was modeled after the streamlined automobiles, which were very expensive at the time, but would soon fall out of fashion. The Hochschule für Gestaltung at Ulm sought an entirely different approach. Rather than creating styled products that consumers would want to jettison after a few short years, it encouraged its designers to create long-lasting, functional products. So here's Hans Gugelow and Dieter Rams's brown SK4 radio phonograph from 1956. Gugolo was a faculty member at the Hochschule für Gestaltung at Ulm, and Rams was a designer for Brown. It was one of the first collaborative efforts between Brown and the design school. So the radio, which is nicknamed Snow White's Coffin, employs a minimalist design with geometric shapes that appear to be arranged in a grid. So the SK4 was wildly popular, and Rams was soon appointed as Brown's chief designer and head of the product design department. Rams, however, was not affiliated with the Hochschule für Gestaltung at Ulm. He had trained as an architect and studied at the Handwerker- und Kunstgewerbeschule in Wiesbaden, which, like the Hochschule für Gestaltung at Ulm, was modeled after the Bauhaus. Now, Rams was not the only graduate from Wiesbaden who worked at Brown. Gerd Alfred Müller and Robert Oberheim also joined the firm. Müller was known for his sculptural working method. So instead of drawing the shape for a product like a food processor, he began by sculpting its form in 3 dimensions. So here you can see how Müller has incorporated geometric forms, but what's also notable is its stark white finish. It appears as though it's emerged out of a laboratory, and it was intended to evoke Brown's efficient, science-based approach to design. His portable mixer from 1964 has a similar design, as does his shaver from 1960. And here you can see how the product and packaging evoke a very similar aesthetic. So even though Rams did not design every Brown product, his name is synonymous with the company since he was its chief designer. And he worked for the firm from 1955 until 1997. So indeed, Rams helped shape the company's corporate identity, and it certainly draws upon the legacy of the Bauhaus. So like Max Bill, Rams has shared his thoughts on what constitutes good design. He states that good design is as little design as possible. Now, what Rams is not suggesting that design does not matter. Rather, the designer should refrain from adding any superfluous ornamentation and should concentrate strictly on the object's function. This includes a sometimes long and arduous process where one studies the object's intended use and how it can meet those aims. And this will allow for a product which Rams describes as quiet, pleasing, comprehensible, and most importantly for our current concern with the Anthropocene, long lasting. So I must be getting close to the end of time because that's what I have to say. So. Sorry, I'll keep my distance.
Well, thank you so much for that sort of lucid and wonderfully concise, discussion of design within the Bauhaus and its legacy. So our next speaker is Elena Plevmonidou, the Director of European Studies, and she teaches in the Department of Germanic and Slavic Studies. Her research is focused on Romantic literature and theory, and she recently organized an online incubator workshop on humanities for the Anthropocene. So Elena, thank you.
Thank you. I think I need to update my faculty profile.
Yeah, well, yes,
Because I will not be mentioning Romanticism today. All right. Okay, I'm on leave, so I'm not teaching this term. So I'm getting used to this environment. It's the first time I'm giving a public lecture since the beginning of the pandemic. So, all right, I will try to breathe. So hello, everybody. Thank you so much. Thomas, who I think is zooming in, right? Yes, Thomas, wherever you are. Thank you for all your hard work in putting together this great event and for inviting me to be a speaker at the colloquium. Thank you also to the Consulate General for bringing us this wonderful exhibition and for the lovely dinner yesterday, which gave us a wonderful opportunity to already start the colloquium half a day early, which was great. So let me begin with a bit of a disclaimer. I'm not an art historian, I'm not an artist, I'm not an architect, I'm not an expert on Bauhaus, all right? But I still have something to say, I think. So how does this go? Oops. So my expertise, teaching and research-wise, intersects with Bauhaus, in as much as I know something about modernism, right? I know something about the cultural and social and political milieu that gave rise to Bauhaus. So here we have Adorno, Horkheimer, Walter Benjamin, so the Frankfurt School critical theory. I work on Bertolt Brecht, on theater in that period. Modernism in general, this is the Metropolis painting by Georges Gros. This is a wonderful visual by John Hartfield, sort of looking back to World War I and looking ahead to the next war that is already building up. So I know something as well about modernist utopian thought that is informed by Marxism, right? So given this background, I do understand very well how Bauhaus emerged and why it emerged in the particular setting of Weimar, Germany, the Bauhaus Foundation coinciding literally with the ongoing kind of constitutional negotiations of the Weimar Republic, right? So I do understand how that, how modernism and Bauhaus have a lot to do with each other and where Bauhaus fits. But I think another reason why Thomas invited me is actually that a more recent research area of mine that I've carved out, namely an area defined broadly as environmental humanities and Anthropocene studies from an environmental humanities perspective. So in fact, this past July, together with a colleague from the University of Puget Sound, I co-organized a research incubator called Humanities for the Anthropocene, Values, Principles, and Practices. And so here, so some of the kind of premises of the research incubator. So here I'm just sort of some key ideas that I'm putting together from that I'm just taking from the call for papers. So the goal of the research incubator was to initiate collaborative work on what it means to be a humanist and what it means to practice the humanities in the present moment and for the future. So we called our workshop Humanities for the Anthropocene rather than in or and, in order to underscore the value, purpose, and politics of our work and our collective actions as scholars. So ours is an ethical gesture. So by calling it Humanities for the Anthropocene, this is an ethical gesture that calls both for kind of a repositioning of what we're doing as well as a response to where we are right now. So the environmental crisis that we're in has implications for all our fields of intellectual activity. Indeed, my friend, collaborator, and I believe that we actually have to proactively initiate the transformation of sort of our humanist disciplines in light of the environmental crisis that we face. So the workshop then invited people to come and bring sort of early or ongoing research to kind of come together and reassess as a collective what it means for humanists to think ecologically today, right? So that's, and then, so here are some research questions that we posed, right? What does it mean to respond to the Anthropocene as humanists? What does it mean to be human today, right? What do artists, scholars, critics within the fields of the humanities have to say about how we as humans are altering the planet? How can the humanities prepare us for the future? And how can it help us face the grief of what is being lost? How can non-Western knowledge systems support an Anthropocene turn of the humanities? How do reconciliation and decolonization interact with environmentalism? So that was the that was what we did this summer, and so it was really quite an astounding response that we received. We thought we'd get maybe 17 or 25 people. We had about 60, so it was a big research incubator, and we ended up having to have parallel sessions and to add another day. So here are some key themes that established as sort of core themes during the workshop. Pedagogy, that was a big one. How do we teach? How do we teach differently, right? Visual and performing arts. We had several panels on visual and performing arts. The theme of the body, disembodied bodies, truncated bodies, bodies in space, bodies and spaces, right? So this sort of constellation. We had several panels on decolonization, anti-racism, diversity, inclusivity, and the kind of interaction of eco-justice and social justice. And even in panels that were not explicitly framed as such, these topics came up. So this was a big topic. Space, place, terrain, landscape, redefining the idea of environment in other terms, because the idea of environment implies that we're kind of separate from it. So how can we reconfigure ideas of space, right? Materials, material culture, the history of material culture, right? That was sort of another topic. And then decentering the human, right? As a kind of a big topic. So, the event was a research incubator, which means it was intended to kickstart the creation of a kind of a research collective, and we have additional plans. We are already planning to meet again next summer. And we want to put together a book. We want to call it the Humanities for the Anthropocene Handbook, a manifesto, right? There are sort of three sort of centers of gravity, right? One is more kind of theory, right? Values, principles, key concepts for the Anthropocene. Then sort of what are sort of future-oriented impulses, how we can redefine interdisciplinarity, how we can rethink the interaction of our disciplines, our humanism with faculties outside of humanities, the sciences and so on. Maybe we need different disciplines, all right? But then also looking back and looking here, there are so many things that we do. How can we reframe what we already do, right? With kind of Anthropocene in view. How do you do medieval studies, Greek and Roman studies, things like that, right? So we need to be kind of backward-looking future people, kind of, right? Backward-looking prophets, that's kind of what we need to be. All right, so that's, I think, the reason why Thomas invited me to come to this colloquium. And so, so then, even though I'm not a Bauhaus expert, what I can do is I can ask, well, what about the Bauhaus in the Anthropocene? Is there Bauhaus for the Anthropocene? What would it look like if we wanted to have a chapter on Bauhaus in the handbook, right? So how would we, what are things that we need to think about, right? In order to reframe the Bauhaus. And now I'm not the Bauhaus expert, and also we have a discussion right after my talk about the Bauhaus and the Anthropocene, so I'm not going to reveal too much. What I'm going to do is actually now be, again, a little bit theoretical and define some concepts. Oops, where is it? Oh, oops, sorry, what did I do? Did I just, yeah. So first of all, because I'm not entirely sure of the nature of the audience, and I think also because the two of you come from architecture and design and art history, maybe we just need to develop a common vocabulary. So I think what I'm going to focus on mostly is actually defining these concepts and explaining, what do we mean with you know, everybody says Anthropocene, what do we mean, right? So I'm just going to define the concepts and then ask some questions about how I would see the Anthropocene, the Bauhaus, sort of what are some questions I would be asking of the Bauhaus, okay? And then we can continue the discussion. So environmental humanities is sort of a bigger field, and then Anthropocene is a kind of a separate field that can be embedded within environmental humanities. And it's not environmental studies. We're not STEM field, right? We are the humanities. So environmental humanities essentially is interdisciplinary research in environmental literature, environmental philosophy, taking our humanities disciplines and sort of seeing what aspects of them have to do with environment, right? Environmental humanities so practicing environmental humanities means asking humanist questions about culture, values, responsibilities, society, etc., in order to address, so with a special focus on the environmental crisis, right? So if we're talking about culture, okay, culture in a specific setting then. And the other thing, of course, is as environmental humanists, we would want to bridge the divides between different knowledge and belief systems relating to the natural world, and also relating to the relationship between nature and culture. Right? We typically we think that culture is separate from nature, but we have to actually abandon this thinking. Really, we have to think of a more integrative way. That is another aspect. And we want to, as environmental humanists, synthesize different disciplinary lines of inquiry in order to open up new ways of thinking through the kind of environmental problems that we find ourselves facing. So the Anthropocene, okay, so that's a separate thing now, right? The scientists, so the hard sciences, think of the Anthropocene slightly differently from humanists, even though there is, of course, a lot of synergy. So the Anthropocene, right? So simple definition, the extent of human environmental impact is so great that it is measurable as a geologic imprint. Yeah, we have left enough, sediment deposits, right? And as a kind of force that affects every sphere of our planet, all right? Also, we are in a sort of entirely human-made geologic period, right? The Jurassic was whatever dinosaur made, right? So if aliens came, 50,000 years later, they would say, aha, here's where the humans were, right? So we are in a human-made geologic epoch, the Anthropocene. And so the term Anthropocene is a contested term, but I think it makes a lot of sense to use this term because it points to us, like it centers us as the cause of the current planet's existential ecological crisis. And it calls on us to take responsibility, right? So Anthropocene. The other key concept to bear in mind when you're thinking about Anthropocene is the idea of Earth system, not nature. Okay, so when we talk about nature, we think about trees and flowers and animals and all the things that are not us, right? Because we are learning to overcome nature, or right? We think of ourselves as being separate from nature. We need to think of the idea of an Earth system, okay? So that is made up of several spheres that are interacting, right? So we've got the Earth, you have the geosphere, the biosphere, the cryosphere, where the glaciers are melting, the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, the water, right? So you have these various spheres. And so the planet isn't just a kind of a static, inactive entity, but it is a dynamic entity of interacting spheres, right? And so when we talk about the Anthropocene, what we mean is that we can see the human interaction with all these spheres and the human impact on all of these spheres. And the human impact on all of these spheres also affects how they interact with each other, okay? So really we have to think on a different scale, right? On a planetary scale, really, right? And so here's sort of a model or kind of a graphic called planetary boundaries, which kind of shows where's humanity at right now, or in 2015. So these are, so in terms of how well the planet is faring, right? So, and what are impacts that endanger the planet's well-being, right? So I don't know, climate change, genetic diversity, biosphere integrity, land system change, freshwater use, etc. You can see that there are some zones where we're kind of reaching the boundary levels, right, where it's pretty critical. All right, let me move on. So so these two images are really the kind of models with which scientists in the STEM fields would be thinking about the Anthropocene. As humanists, we also like to do history, right? We also like to do culture. So we want to locate the Anthropocene in history. Many of the debates in the humanities have to do with when did it start, right? Typical humanist question. When did something start and when did it happen? How did it happen? And there's sort of a real debate and not so much a conflict, but different ways of situating the Anthropocene tells a different part of the same history, right? So one is the Columbian exchange. So Columbus finds America, and it's called the Columbian exchange because you start exchanging biological, chemical, genetic, human food, plants, all sorts of things get exchanged between the continents, and you can start seeing a certain impact of a certain part of humanity, right? So coming from Europe, spreading, and there's a political impact. We have colonization, we have slavery. So the Columbian exchange narrative of the Anthropocene emphasizes very much the interaction of environmental impact with stories of colonization, okay? We have, we have Capitalocene. So this is with, so situating the kind of Anthropocene with industrialization and capitalism, right, as sort of a measurable impact on the planet system, on the Earth system. And the last one is, so this one would be late 18th, early 19th century. And then the Great Acceleration is from the second half of the 20th century onwards. So after World War II, after the nuclear bombs, right, you have every single graphic that sort of measures sort of human activity, whether it's consumption, it's production of garbage, production of plastic, environmental degradation, etc. You can see the graphics going like this, and then they go super dramatically up, right? So the Great Acceleration is sort of the most recent event. But I think if we want to have a more comprehensive or sophisticated understanding of the Anthropocene, we would see all these three narratives not excluding each other, but complementing parts of the story. All right, so then I sort of invite you to look at this image where we have a kind of an Earth system that is so diverse and so large and so complex, and it has so many different entities, living and non-living, interacting with each other. And then we have these events that center the human being, right? So we have a real tension, a real problem here, right? So humanity and the planet, right? So when we want to study or do Anthropocene studies, especially as humanists, what we want to find out is how can we humans stop thinking just about ourselves, right? How can we decenter the human being and sort of place the human being in this zone, right? Where we are in continuity with a very dynamically active planetary system, and we're just one part of it, or we should be just one part of it, right? So when I ask them the question about Bauhaus, right? So of course we have to ask the question. So is it what are aspects of the design that are sustainable, environmental, etc.? But I think we might want to broaden a little bit and sort of say, is the Bauhaus able to take on an Earth system view? Right? Can it broaden, which means can it be a little less human-centered? Right? So can the Bauhaus find a way of decentering the Anthropocene, the Anthropos, right, in our era, which is a huge question, right? And so I have some causes for skepticism, because I think that the modernism itself might be a bit of an obstacle to that, because the modernism is so I'll just very briefly summarize this because I think I'm running out of time. But modernism is really going very much with sort of affirming aspects of sort of industrialization, of aspects of mass production, mass culture. It's very urban, right? I don't see the Bauhaus necessarily in the forest, right? I see it in the big cities, right? So the Bauhaus modernism is part of urban culture. So then the questions that we would have to ask if we wanted to include Bauhaus in this handbook on the humanities for the Anthropocene is we would have to ask, how can we rethink urban culture then, perhaps, right? How can we think urbanity in that sense? I had this song by Bertolt Brecht, the Song of the Machines, right? This isn't the wind in the maples, my boy, no song to the lonely moon. This is the wild war of our daily toil, the curse. We curse it and we count it a boon. It is the voice of our cities, right? It is our favorite song. It is the language we all understand. It will soon be the world's mother tongue, right? The song of the machines. So how can we take that sort of celebration also, right? Modernism celebrates high industrialism as well, right? It celebrates it. It doesn't just critically interrogate it. So how can we kind of slightly estrange that, perhaps, right? Is a question that we might want to ask. So looking at these buildings, what we see is exactly that, right? So this is in Tel Aviv. This is the Fun or the Mies van der Rohe, right, villa in Chicago, right? I mean, it speaks of immense privilege and it speaks of big cities as well, right? So how can we refract the light here a little bit different as we look on it? I also see here sort of in the performing arts of Bauhaus, the triadic ballet. So what is the concept of nature at play here, right? What is the concept of the human? So we would have to ask a lot of these questions. But, and I'll just kind of very quickly, we do have to also, we can flip the question and sort of say, let me just see, kind of, okay, we can think of the Anthropocene in two ways. We're kind of as a humanity stuck here, right? Because we keep reproducing, like the solutions that we find or approach very often to our environmental crisis keep reproducing the same problems. They just look different. Each solution has a different guise, but ultimately we remain stuck in the same patterns, right? Do we want to transport our oil with trains or with pipelines? Right, but we are still inside the fossil fuel industry. So what we need is sort of utopian impulses. We need to be able sort of think outside the box. And when I kind of start looking at the kind of the utopian questions that are open-ended, that want us to, that want to help us break outside of the kind of one-dimensional thinking where we keep sort of reproducing capitalist solutions to capitalist problems, I find myself asking questions that the Bauhaus asked itself in terms of its core values, sort of interrogating how humans interact with each other, how they interact with space, breaking down the kind of structures that stifle us intellectually and spiritually, breaking down boundaries of the familiar, freeing the mind, right, the creative mind, or if we just look at the Bauhaus Manifesto, right? So these are, these are their core values from that original manifesto, right? Sort of breaking down social hierarchies and value hierarchies, for example, or idea of interdisciplinarity, the idea of simplicity, utility, durability of materials and tools and products, the idea of having kind of a community of collaborators, I think perhaps so for me, one of the most important ways in which the Bauhaus can contribute to kind of Anthropocene studies from a humanist perspective is to kind of reopen their utopian project ultimately and see how can that be translated into the 21st century. And I'll leave it at that.
Great, thank you, Elena, so much. And I think you've opened it. Thank you so much. You've opened out, lots of things that we can talk about in the panel discussion that's coming up. So if I can invite our speakers, I guess maybe if we kind of have 3 chairs here would be good, because then you can kind of engage in a conversation and talk to the audience. Now, the reason why I'm opening up my computer here is that Thomas provided me with some notes for this discussion, and I think this is where we feel his absence very much, and so I'm just going to read some of the points that he makes as maybe would you like to all sort of come and sit here? So we've got this panel on the relevance of the Bauhaus approach in times of the Anthropocene. So what he says is, I'd like to situate the intention of this colloquium, as we heard the title, and explain the aims of the panel. When I went, when in 2019, I met with Consul General Dr. Klaus Schmidt at the occasion of the fall of the Berlin Wall. Commemoration of the fall of the Berlin Wall. He commented that he had a wonderful collection of photographs featuring Bauhaus-inspired buildings from around the world by the German photographer Jean Molitor. And he said Thomas was saying that he had an enduring interest in the Bauhaus School since 2011, when he visited Weimar for a few days, and the buildings which of the original school and presently the Bauhaus University are located. Aside from its visually attractive architectural design style, as a philosopher of aesthetics, I was struck by Walter Gropius's idea to found a school that would reimagine the material world to reflect the unity of all arts. Moreover, as someone who has been working on the cultural dimensions of climate change, I came to think that the historical precedent set by the Bauhaus to transform society with intentional design was a grand way to balance the often catastrophic ways in which the climate change has often been portrayed. As a consequence of the Anthropocene, it's now become a way to think through the extraordinary aspects of the impacts of humans throughout the planet, as Elena was talking about. It seemed to me that an intentional design approach, as modeled by the Bauhaus, could be inspiring, especially to our students at the University of Victoria. And for this reason, together with many others, I've endeavored to organize this event. In this spirit, I've asked our speakers to briefly address in this panel, to round out their presentations by speaking of the relevance of the Bauhaus for addressing the challenges posed by the Anthropocene. And then lastly, he says, thank you all for attending the event, and thanks to all the speakers and those who have helped bring it about. So in that context, actually, perhaps as we've already had a round of applause for Jean Molitor, maybe we could have a similar one for Thomas, who's unable to be here. Right, so on that note, I'm wondering, if we start that discussion. So, he's talking about the relevance of the Bauhaus for addressing challenges posed by the Anthropocene. And perhaps also, if I could just also think about one of the things that struck me is that perhaps unintentionally, it's created a language of architecture that's all over the world and has had perhaps in some ways a deleterious impact on local styles of building and also local solutions. I mean, I was thinking in a Middle Eastern context of people like Hassan Fatih using mud brick and trying to think in sort of modernist terms about a material like that, or the way in which, again, across the Middle East, you see modernist blocks that have to have air conditioning systems, whereas in places like Iran, you have wind catchers and various ways of actually naturally cooling buildings. And so, I mean, that may not have been the intention of the Bauhaus, but, are there sort of issues that we could think about there as well? So I hope it'll sort of work if I sort of allow you to, maybe who'd like to start on thinking about these things?
Sure, I'll get started. Yeah, I believe the Bauhaus does offer a model to live sustainably for our current era in climate change, and you probably guarded that a bit in terms of how it influenced brown product designs. But the one thing that I want to stress is, and also in terms of thinking of modernism, and modernism speaking specifically about architecture. And I want to refer to Sarah Goldhagen, who is an architectural historian, and suggests that modernism is not a style, it's a discourse, right? So think of it this way. Looking at a modernist building and just replicating that by the way that it looks, and that's part of the problem with Philip Johnson when he puts up the show at the Museum of Modern Art. It's in 1932, it calls it the international style, right? So people were replicating these square box buildings, but not all modernist designs are square boxes. As you know, Bruno Taut loves curves, right? So it's a series of practices. It's a series of thinking about how you can make design. And when it emerged in the 1920s, what was very important in terms of Germany is affordable housing for working classes who were living in squalid conditions, which we saw with your paper, which is fantastic. Okay? So I think today we can shift that to also think about sustainability. And we see that with contemporary architects who are thinking about cross-laminated timber, which is more sustainable than things like concrete. But there's still a problem with modernism in that it still concentrates on the new buildings, new designs. Perhaps there's still a critique of that. You know, there is. Revitalization is important too, right? So working with existing city spaces, and that's where Ego, which you had shown, which essentially wiped out the community in St. Louis, the whole area, put up these towers, which were really actually ineffective because they just weren't maintained, right? It's not that the buildings themselves are bad. There's a lot of people who live in these kinds of buildings in Burnaby. They're quite happy to live in them. It was just that it had to do with race. It had to do with buildings not being maintained. But the long and short of it is, yes, I think there's a solution with thinking about modernism, thinking of it as practices in terms of good design, not copying other things, but thinking of how does it work functionally, right? And one of the parts of function is how does it function for the planet, not just humans. But we don't always need to just look at the new. We can still look at the old, and again, not just in terms of styles, not just building a new building that has, you know, Greek and Roman or people like columns and pediments and whatever else, throw it onto it. I mean, what I mean is by revitalizing existing buildings, right? So reusing that space. So I've probably said enough.
Yeah. I just want to add to what Menno said. So the Bauhaus specifically, what's so special about it is that it addressed the current issues of their epoch from a very egalitarian, holistic approach. For the first time, you know, they weren't just looking to the members of the elite, and the elite, you know, the Elon Musks and whatever the other people are there looking into space, whereas the rest of us mortals, we have to somehow look how we are surviving on Earth. And that aspect of, you know, taking care of the masses and finding solutions, societal solutions for everyone, I think that is the important aspect, or one of the important aspects of Bauhaus, more than maybe the brick and mortar itself, the attitude of helping everyone and finding solutions in an egalitarian way. And looking at your presentation, it dawned on me that we actually, or I, for one, approach this Anthropocene topic as from a very Eurocentric perspective. You know, what is it that we in the Western world need, and you know, how can we? But actually, it's global, and I'm wondering if, and maybe you can speak about that. If the problems we have, yes, we all live in the same epoch, but are the problems we have all homogeneous, or
no? That's a really important question, and that's why I put the 3 different narratives of the Anthropocene there, because they all have validity, but they tell a different part of the story. And I think it is really important to so when you look at the sort of the planetary perspective, and you're looking at material culture, right? So materials, right? So we, you know, gems. We love all kinds of different gems, or we need certain materials to produce whatever, teapot, a tea kettle, etc. Where do they come from? Where are they produced? How do the people live who produce them? And so that's where sort of eco-justice, social justice, racial justice are all really interconnected. At my workshop, there was one presenter from Australia. That was a really amazing presentation that went right to where your question is going. And he was talking about the shadowlands, right? So the places that nobody can go anymore. Nobody wants to go anymore because they have been so degraded environmentally. And they're so far away from Europe. They're so far away from the global north, right? Or if they are even in our countries, then where we privileged people don't want to go. So the people, the consumers of the products don't go to these places, so they're the shadowlands, but there are communities who live there. And so his research project was sort of a community engaged research project to connect with the people who have no choice but to live in the shadowlands, the places that we affluent people can say, well, I don't need to know this, right? I just want the products. And so how do you, and what he observed was that, of course, when we talk about the Anthropocene, we talk about imprint, measurable imprint, but actually there's a whole impact of the Anthropocene that doesn't leave a trace, which is trauma and grief and right. So these are the more spiritual and emotional aspects and psychological aspects of our impact on the Anthropocene or on the planet, and so it is not the same. And so the questions that we need to ask are different. But I think it would be sort of neat to kind of to go back now to the question about Bauhaus and sort of say, okay, so if Bauhaus is indeed a sort of a modern, takes modernism as praxis, as a kind of practice, rather than a set of sort of a particular period or style. I mean, Habermas also calls modernity, right, the incomplete project, right? That's why he actually rejects postmodernism, right? Because modernity is open-ended. So let's take some of the ideas of Bauhaus that are quite utopian, that are egalitarian, that are very much concerned with, not the elites, but the masses, right? And vulnerable people and precariously living people. And so let's take that mindset and go to the shadowlands. How would we think of that space differently? Would that type of mindset enable us to explore that space differently and the people and the environment differently, and maybe think or help design solutions to living in that space, to making that space livable anyway, right? So perhaps the Bauhaus too, we shouldn't think of as a static historical period, but really as an attitude, as a designer attitude, as an aesthetic attitude that goes into places and spaces and observes the materials and the things that are there and kind of works with them on their own terms. Perhaps that is sort of something that Bauhaus would have potentially an ability to do.
I think potentially, but the problem is what happened though is that these types of buildings were brought to places imposed as colonial structures, right? And reshaping that space without looking at the local solutions, like things like air conditioning, which may not be as effective as using natural forms of ventilation, right? And I think that that's where, again, there's a problem of looking at things dogmatically as, okay, well, this worked here, and therefore this will work elsewhere. And I think this is, and it's not the Bauhaus, but speaking about Le Corbusier, who's also well-known modernist architect, he gets very much criticized because people will just look at the Ville Contemporaine, which again, I use the example of Burnaby because people are familiar with that. Towers in the park, green space, the Congrès International d'Architecture Moderne. put out planning principles. But what did architects do? They ended up just copying those towers. But Le Corbusier himself, when he designed buildings in Algeria, it actually followed the natural space. They're curvilinear. He put in, le brise soleil, which is to offer sun shading, right? It wasn't so much just, okay, well, I'm just going to take this one building solution and copy it over and over. There are other architects that have done that, which probably just wasn't thoughtful. And then it comes down to things like cost, especially in colonization, picking solutions that they know that works, bring the materials in, and it doesn't work because it's for a particular climate that it was effective, right? So, and again, it's that problem which I see in its way. And again, following Goldhagen with more broadly of just modernism, again, it's a series of practices. It's not a style. And that's where it gets problematic when you're just looking at replicating an existing product versus, visual properties, right? And I think that's one of the issues when we're speaking about the Bauhaus, and it was still some of Gropius's concerns was creating aesthetically pleasing products, right? And this is where what we see though with Hannes Meyer, you mentioned was the second director, what was his argument for architecture was its function times economy. Aesthetics shouldn't be part of the question, right? So it's still coming down to those practical questions and concerns. And I think where you can get to a lot of answers around what we call functional beauty, and I know beauty is a very contested term, but Max Bill, who's also a student of Bauhaus, is writing about this, is where you can think about functional beauty also in terms of sustainability. Does it work as well? But it's again thinking very much around process, which is what Dieter Rams was doing at Brown. And speaking with our Consul General yesterday at dinner, he mentioned, of course, that Apple's Steve Jobs looked at Dieter Rams' products. And when you have your calculator function on your Apple, it looks very much like Brown's calculator, right? And the thing that I was thinking about with Dieter Rams, because some of you might go and Google Dieter Rams, and one of the first things that you'll see is Apple and Dieter Rams. And because Steve Jobs looked to Dieter Rams, but what you see is a replication of these visual products. And what I also want to push and to think about sustainability is the problems of tech, right? Speaking of planned obsolescence, I mean, everybody replaces their phone within a year, within 2 years, and beautiful phones from iPhones. And I don't think that's necessarily in the same spirit as what Dieter Rams was trying to do, because again, for him, it's process and aesthetics was almost out of the question. It's like it's important, but it's not the driving force. And when you get a new camera, yes, with new functions and just beautiful looking things that people will want to buy within the next year at, what are they now, $1,300, with very expensive materials that are being mined in places like Africa.
Expensive is something I thought about Apple, and you mentioned capitalism creates problems. And looking at your presentation, you were showing all this fancy products that emerged, and I was just thinking, so much stuff. Do we need so much stuff, right? And and producing it, like there is architecture buildings that we need, but do we need this fancy, I don't know, mixture, or just can't we just like mix it with our spoon? And would you say there is a contradiction between the ideology of Bauhaus being, socialist and anti-capitalist, but then Hans Meyer, also took care of economy, and then you mentioning that capitalism creates all kinds of problems. Like, how would we solve, like from an economic perspective, solve the problem that we have with climate change?
Right. So I'm going to put on my critical theory hat. and kind of, I don't know, what would Adorno say? I think the problem is that capitalism has built within it the kind of insatiable need for profit, right? And I mean, what does Marx call it? Marx calls the money machine, like it sweats money from every pore, right? This is sort of Marx in Das Kapital, right? The problem is that you can, how do you make capitalism restrain itself? I mean, right, that's the question. If we are going to reckon with the Anthropocene in any kind of constructive way, we need to make capitalism restrain itself? Do we need all this stuff? Do we need, right? I mean, so we're going to get electric cars, and I think there's electric airplanes in production or something, but what about our presumption that we get to fly everywhere, that we get to drive everywhere, right? Maybe we need to restrain that, right? And is the capitalistic system built for that? And of course it isn't, right? And so what you need is a kind of a separation of government from economy, right? So I'm thinking again about Habermas, the structural transformation of the public sphere, this sort of defining book by Jürgen Habermas, where he kind of talks about how, well, there was a concept of the public which was separate from pure economic interests, right? And economic interests are private interests. They're not public interests, right? Somebody owns ultimately, right? Somebody is a CEO of a company. His interests or their interests are private, and the public is a community, right? So the examples that you brought, for example, are really wonderful because they show a public sphere, right? You cannot have these community projects without a public sphere that is separate from purely economic interests, because economic interests are driven to generate profit. That's it, right? They will not restrain themselves. So you need a public sphere, like a really solid public sphere that is capable to put the brakes on capitalism, ultimately. Right?
Yeah, however, I would say that it is important to have, the buildings that we saw, they need to be sustainable, like they need to be economically viable. Otherwise, we have the Priago and Caprini Greens, right? They were demolished because they couldn't run them anymore. They were too expensive. So there needs to be a balance between ideology or utopia, and but then also being realistic and thinking of economy and being able to sustain money-wise in monetary terms.
Absolutely, and that's why I think that the solution isn't communism, right? Communism is not aesthetically pleasing, right? I mean, I think it is really important to have aesthetically pleasing, functional things for people who don't have a lot of money, right? That aesthetic dimension humanizes life, right? So you can't just have pure functionality because it's economical. Right. So I agree. The idea of sustainability has an economic dimension, but who's the dog and who's the tail and who gets to wag whom is really the question. So are the economic interests the overriding ones, or like where do we locate the agency? And I think it is really important that agency is located firmly within sort of community and public sphere.
Actually, I'm wondering on that note, we're going to set aside some time for the audience to kind of engage in this discussion. So are there any people who'd like to kind of jump in the question?
Yeah, I want to take this up. Thank you so much. I mean, this has been super enlightening and I have enjoyed every minute of it. You mentioned the shadowlands, and I would like to bring the concept of the shadowlands, not remotely, but in our cities. What happens and what through planning, intentionally or not, I don't think intentionally, has been in many times, a way of dividing cities and making affordable or non-affordable according to a kind of discrimination. So, and I would like to think, or I would like to ask, so how can we see the role of the Bauhaus and the principle of inclusivity, and lack of discrimination brought in today's terms into the planning sphere and ensure that the cities, have a more holistic planning?
I think you should answer that.
Yeah, that's a good question. Exactly. So one way is really to include the community for every aspect, but especially the human right needs, which is healthcare, education, and housing. To really be inclusive, you need to know. So typically decision makers, which is, professors, doctors, architects, politicians, they are members of the elite most of the time, and they live in their own land, but then they are supposed to serve those who are not the elite. How are you going to bridge that gap between, this world and this world? The best way to do that is to have consultation and what you mentioned, dialogue, right? The discourse and dialogue to really be interested in what it is that the masses need. Do they really need an expensive MacBook that they need to replace in 2 years because there's another model, or is there another way to enable people access to a computer and the internet? Same with dwelling, same with healthcare solutions. So people, a lot of times, in my observation at least, when we are trying to solve the problems of our era, it is people who don't really know what the real problems of the masses are. And here they are trying to help, but how are you going to do that when you cannot really authentically understand where these people come from, right? And that's actually why we are more and more approaching the diversity, inclusion, and equity approach now, right? Because we are trying to actually hire those in higher positions who are experiencing this form of discrimination.
Okay, so we have time for a couple more questions.
I have one question in principle. How much is the problem that our modern Western society faces based on the deification of the individual and the cost of the community? Because as far as I have seen in some countries where you have a more community-spirited approach to public policy and city planning, you don't have quite the same problems. You have more cooperative housing units, which are multi-generational and produce a totally different feeling of a society that still functions.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, so again, thinking from the perspective of the insatiable appetite of capitalism for profit, right? How do you get more profit is if you have the humanity as a set of separate individuals, because they're all separate consumers, right? That need separate things, that need, everyone needs their own car, everyone needs their own TV in their room, everyone needs, right, et cetera, right? So absolutely. So I think that's why one of the bullet points, right, about kind of environmental humanities that's really critical is just going out to different knowledge systems. You just need to go to different cultural spaces and ideas of society, value systems, spiritual frameworks, etc.
But even in our society can function, because in Victoria we have at least a few cooperatives where there is one lawnmower and one hedge trimmer, where you have even a communal kitchen that people can join and work in. Things like that, it's possible.
The only problem is when it gets co-opted by business like Airbnb, which was the sharing economy and now drove up.
Then to permit anybody in the cooperative, as a member of a cooperative, you have responsibilities, not only privileges.
Sure. I just mean in terms of that the idea had come about with things like car sharing or like Airbnb, for instance, and I'm using that explicitly because of Otis's paper, which in the trailer that you show, which Airbnb was certainly not welcome because yes, that drives up prices. But the whole idea behind that, of course, was initially to keep costs lower, people sharing their houses. But now, what really the side effect is that staying in an Airbnb becomes more and more expensive, and now landlords are not renting out their places; they're just using them as Airbnbs. Sure you're familiar with, and that helps drive up the costs of housing, becomes more expensive. We have speculators, and there we have again for profit, which is the problem. And that's where public policy, if it's looking at economics, and I guess that's the difference in terms of economics is with managing the home as opposed to economics for profit.
Exactly.
And perhaps, and this is probably about a, nearly impossible to change because everybody has their vested interests. But if, like we were saying, government was disconnected from economics for profit and then always looking at things like the GDP, and which naturally results in the exploitation of more resources, which affects the climate.
But there are economies that I mean, it's not, it doesn't have to always be kind of this, the unlimited, expansion of a market. I mean, there are so many social models where people feel like I'm earning enough, I've got a good living, I don't need more, right? So I think you can do that on a societal scale, right? Not just on an individual scale.
So I think we have time for just one more. So.
Oh, did you want? No, I was just going to make a comment.
Well, and I think that when we're thinking of sustainable projects, I think we also have to think about what we mean by community, because I mean, communities are often imagined and doesn't necessarily address social inequalities or discrimination. So there have been studies of intentional communities where you have the one lawnmower and so forth that are very cooperative, but there's also an application system. And so not everybody has equal access to these communities, and the community can decide who they find, that they want to include, and this may result in various forms of discrimination. Similarly, and I was speaking to I was involved in the Cornerstone project in Burnwood years ago, and it was an amazing community development project where we purchased the Cornerstone building at Gladstone and Fernwood, which was, it was owned by a lawyer in Vancouver, and he just simply allowed it to fall apart. And so we decided to purchase the Cornerstone, and it was a big community project where we gutted the building and we did all kinds of stuff. But the interesting part of this was because that hub of Fernwood was kind of falling apart, people in the community were really excited because their property values would increase through this community development project, and at the same time displacing certain populations from Fernwood, and it was a gentrification project. So on the one hand, it was amazing. And on the other hand, you could see the ripple effects of this. In fact, then you created a new shadow community that was displaced elsewhere. So I think thinking through kind of the politics and the social aspects of intentional communities or community development is something to keep in mind.
Absolutely.
Great. Well, perhaps we can thank our panelists for a wonderful discussion.
So we're just 2 or 3 minutes off schedule, but so I'll just close out this part, and we'll be then moving to the guided tour that Don will be giving us around campus. So last of all, just thanks to everybody who's taken part in this, and that's very much all the questions and ideas that have come from the audience as well, and just sort of maybe kind of taking us right back to the beginning and the discussion about the territory acknowledgement and what that means. I mean, of course, we've been talking about property and sustainable living, but on unceded territories, and I think it's worth sort of coming back and thinking about that and how we're all implicated in these issues of what it means to live on these lands as uninvited guests. So thank you very much to everybody, and we'll now move on to the tour.
I was wondering if I could have a moment before we disperse. How many people are going on the tour? Hands up. So I'm counting about 15. That's perfect, because I won't have to talk too loud. Now the tour, I have 7 buildings only, but we'll finish back at the library. And I have two other buildings to show you. And there was a slide, you're not gonna be able to see it very much, but there is a mural on the campus done by one artist, Herbert Siegner. Those hands, anybody seen it? So I'll be taking anybody that wants to see that mural in the student